I'd love to introduce our next speaker, who is talking about a fascinating subject. Dr. Cal Cooper is an associate professor of psychology at the University of Northampton. He lectures on parapsychology, positive psychology, thanatology, and social psychology. He is the author and editor of 5 books to date, including Telephone Calls from the Dead and PSI in Psychotherapy. He is the recipient of such awards as the Eileen J. Garrett Scholarship from 2009, Parapsychology Foundation, Alex Tannis Scholarship Award, numerous since 2011, and grants, and the D. Scott Rogo Award for Media, 2021 Parapsychology Foundation. Yeah, you've had quite a lot of awards. So
yes.
I'm really excited to hear this, because I've had an experience of a call from maybe the dead, but I'll maybe tell you later. But yeah, I'd love to welcome Cal with his talk on phone calls from the dead. Take it away.
Wonderful. Well, great. Thank you very much. I suppose I can add to that list of awards. Last night, I got a lovely one for excellence in doctoral supervision. I've got 9 PhD students under me, pretty much all in parapsychology, and a lot of them dealing with survival-themed topics. So after-death communications, mediumship, near-death experiences, and a few other interesting ones, some based in art, such as spirit art, and also looking at early spirit photography as well. At the University of Northampton, we've got a Centre of Excellence for Research called Exceptional Experiences and Consciousness Studies, in which we have a group of people interested in parapsychology, transpersonal psychology, consciousness studies, cognitive psychology, and neuroscience, all coming together to look at these topics. There's about 15 members of staff out of the 40 psychologists that we have. So it's really great that we have this active group, essentially with parapsychology interests, dedicated lab space, and we're even working with the flotation tank on campus as well to look at altered states of consciousness. But the talk for today is phone calls from the dead, something that interested me a lot as an undergraduate student, because I was looking at the works of D. Scott Rogo and Raymond Bayliss, and I was getting many of their second-hand out-of-print books. And one of them was called Phone Calls from the Dead, that they'd co-authored. They contributed a preface or an introduction to each other's books here and there, but this is the only major collaboration that they did, and it was a 2-year investigation in people that have made such claims. And the title was a little bit misleading, because it wasn't all to do with people that had interaction, I believe, with people from the dead. It was to do with any unusual experience regarding the telephone, but predominantly those experiences were associated with someone known to be dead. That's why we went with that title. So let me tell you a little bit more about this. So what is an anomalous telephonic communication? Well, it can be described as any communication found to be irregular by the maker or the receiver of the call, which appears to defy rational explanation or conventional explanation. Phone call phenomenon or anomalous phone contact, you might hear them mentioned as that, or even ITC, instrumental transcommunication. So it could be a telephone conversation with someone known to be dead. It could be a telephone conversation with an entity presumed to be extraterrestrial in origin. Or it could be a call carried out by someone who was proved to be nowhere near a telephone at the time that the alleged call was made or received. I suppose it has some slight interest and overlaps to telephone telepathy. I have mentioned that in some of my works before, but this is something quite different. And telephone telepathy is very interesting. I'm sure speaking to you now, if I describe it, you're thinking of someone that you don't regularly make a call to. It's not, a brother, a sister, a parent on a weekend. It's Uncle Bob who emigrated and you haven't spoken to in ages, and the telephone rings and you pick it up and it's that very person, or an email pings through now, or a text message. It's got that relatability with the telephone aspect, but it's not something that was particularly covered by Scott Rogo or Raymond Bayliss, but you'll certainly find that work with Rupert Sheldrake. So let me take you through a little bit of the history and where recognition for this came about. And essentially it came about at the very moment we started to develop communication techniques using electrical systems. So even the wireless telegraph, so using Morse code systems. In the journal Light, which is the journal that's produced by the College of Psychic Studies, that was founded in 1881, David Wilson was a solicitor, a lawyer in London, who wrote an article talking about developing a wireless telegraph where he'd even removed the receiving area at the back, and he'd replaced the I don't know what it was a galvanometer instead of the click, so he got these recognizable beeps to make listening to the Morse code a lot easier. And he was getting strange messages through on this device, even though the receiving wire had been removed. And the messages would read things like, wait 7 days and 4 hours. So he'd wait around for 6 days and 7 hours and be sat by the machine, and nothing would happen. But he'd get all these strange messages and instructions. He'd even bring other people in to sit with him and transcribe and translate the Morse code, and just to check that he wasn't getting the messages wrong. And indeed, they would be of the kind that he was getting, but nothing would happen following these instructions. They questioned whether it had something to do with a machine in the local vicinity, maybe the next building, and it was still picking up on messages from another wireless telegraph. But ultimately, his description was that these messages were coming from extraterrestrials rather than from spirit, which was interesting as an earlier interpretation for these. One of the next people that I literally just discovered a bit more writing about them, I think it's in Nandor Fodor's book. I think it's called Between Worlds or something like that. There's a whole chapter on Francis Grierson. Francis Grierson posed as a traveling medium in Europe. They were known for writing a lot of literature in California, but presented mediumistic abilities when he turned up in Europe. Particularly to do with music and being able to get involved in musical scores that he'd allegedly never taught himself or been taught. I'm just starting to learn a little bit more about him. I just knew that he went under the name Jesse Shepherd as a traveling medium, which was actually some of his middle names. He just mixed up different elements of his name around to present himself as this medium outside of being a literary figure. But the very last book that was produced by Grierson was called Psychophone Messages, and the book details using a psychophone with some assistance in a seance setting and recording voices of the dead. Now, a psychophone was one of the early gramophones that could also be used as a dictaphone as well. It used the wax cylinders where the needle will go down them instead of a big vinyl record where it would work its way into the middle. But you could get blank wax cylinders as well and put the machine on reverse and essentially speak into the trumpet, and it would carve into the wax cylinder the vibrations of your voice and essentially your speech. So on playback, you effectively had a dictaphone. And that's how I think they were using it. Is not particularly described well in the book Psychophone Messages. It's a very scarce book, but it's been scanned and reprinted. So places like Amazon and other platforms like that are selling the reprints of this book. So you get these slight details that it's not quite a normal psychophone, it's been adapted somehow. But then you get these very strange page after pages messages that you wouldn't get, particularly from recordings. When you look into EVP, electronic voice phenomena, we don't seem to get like 3 or 4 pages of transcript, but he did, allegedly. And these would be from people such as Abraham Lincoln, General U.S. Grant, and many other large figures in America that were predicting World War III and various other world predictions as well to come. So it's a very unusual tale that just has a big question mark hang over it as to what really was going on there. Then we have F.R. Melton, who was a spiritualist, and I suppose you could call him an amateur engineer in Nottingham. So my hometown, I'm currently in Northampton right now. And Melton, I started digging into his history even more beyond writing the book Telephone Calls from the Dead. He did several articles for the journal Light as well. So again, the College of Psychic Studies. And he produced this booklet in 1921, just called A Psychic Telephone. Again, extremely scarce. You won't find it anywhere. I tried in Nottingham libraries, the British Library and beyond. And it wasn't until I was in San Francisco a few years ago, back in 2019, and I was going through D. Scott Rogo's archive, and I found a photocopied version of it that Scott must have done. What happened with Melton was quite interesting. He was professing all kinds of things. It seems there's an interesting history to him, even that maybe his BSc that he kept putting after his name in articles wasn't actually real. I've tried to track down his history of qualifications, and nowhere seems to have a record of him studying at the places he claimed to, and people even brought him up on this at the time. So certainly someone that was prone to wild claims, but he developed a machine that could allegedly capture spirit voice and ectoplasm. It had some sort of test tube in it. And you see pictures of this in his first article, one of his first articles on the machine, for Light. And then he decided to adapt the machine further, and it's due to a story that he gives in his article. He was entertaining a guest one Easter, and with his wife and youngest son, they were holding a seance. And his elder son comes in, who was working for the military at a college, showing students or military personnel about to go into military how to mend radios and telephones. And as he walked in, he scoffed at what they were doing, the fact that they were holding a seance. He'd recently been engaged. He was in love with a lady that had worked at one of the electrical shops where he went to buy different components for the college. And she passed away from a short illness, and he was absolutely distraught, and all the family had hoped that they would get married. Now, back in those days, they were still effectively sending text messages. They were both very capable wireless telegraph operators. And you would usually have a starting code with a Morse code to know who you're contacting or who's contacting you. And so they had all these little signals and clues that they would know, okay, it's my loved one making contact with me. So he scoffs the seance that he sees his family doing. And his younger brother says, shh, we're getting a message from J, or I can't remember the initials, but gives the initials of his deceased fiance. That perks his attention. So he comes into the room and listens in, and they're effectively getting raps on the table out in Morse code. So he sits down and listens and tells them what he can hear coming through on Morse code. And he's captivated. It seems to be his deceased fiance. So Melton then says, well, you could help me, use your skills to help me develop a second machine. I know you can't attend spiritualist churches with me. It seems that because you came into the element to you, I would like you to put a little bit of yourself in the machine, as it were, and we'll come back to that. Electronic voice phenomena is not particularly the same as these telephone contacts, but this is the alleged recording of voices of the dead. It can also include bangs, raps, scratches that weren't heard, allegedly, on recording. One of the people that first reported this in I suppose, a controlled setting would be Raymond Bayless. So he rented out a studio in California. They made it a soundproof recording studio. And with someone who claimed to be an astral projector, Attila Bonzale, they would do these recordings. And Attila would, I think, try and prompt spirit to pose a recording onto the tape, the magnetic tape. It would be a reel-to-reel recorder in a soundproof box. And on playback, they were getting voices, raps, bangs, and scratches. And Raymond Bayless published this as a letter to editor in 1959 in the Journal of the American Society for Psychical Research. No one really cared. No one paid attention to it. Psychical research was moving away in some ways from ghosts and hauntings, though papers still existed, but the whole idea of electronic contact, it was just something completely different. And yet, in the same year, Friedrich Jürgensen, who was a Swedish, I think he'd been involved in opera singing and was a filmmaker, he was recording bird songs, and on playback claimed that he got the recordings of his mother's voice. Because he got the contacts for the media and the outreach, he became famous for discovering EVP. So when you read a lot of popular books on paranormal and there's any chapter on EVP, it may very well mention Friedrich Jürgensen instead of Raymond Bayless. But then there are other famous characters such as Dr. Konstantin Raudover, in which he published a book called Breakthrough, which came with an accompanying vinyl record. So you could listen to his recordings. And then David Ellis, who for 2 years was the Perrott Warwick student scholar, who was asked to follow up on Raudover's research and present reports back to the SDR about what he thought was going on. he essentially believed that there was a lot of psychology going on when it came to people listening to playback and trying to interpret some of these very strange, scratchy, random noises. With telephone communication, we have some dribs and drabs of reports in different books and chapters here, there, and everywhere. So there was a book published in Brazil with its translation of title being Voices from Beyond by Telephone by Oscar de Argonal. This particular medium, who wrote up their experiences, believed that they had the best communications when picking up the telephone and allowing the dead to manipulate the line somehow and produce recognized speech. And so that's detailed in that particular book. And then nothing really after that. It's just here, there, and everywhere in the literature if you really dig. So while Raymond Bayliss was still doing EVP research, he was mentoring a young Scott Rogo, who was publishing his first papers by the age of 16 in the Journal of Paraphysics, and published his first book while he was an undergraduate. And later on, by the 1970s, mid-1970s, they were talking to people about this EVP research, and they would say, oh, I had a strange instance of what I think was the dead speaking to me over the telephone. Do you want to hear about that? Or a strange instance with the telephone. Or a psychologist would say they got one of these cases on file, or some other colleague. So they were realizing that more and more of these cases were cropping up that weren't quite like EVP. So they finally, after a few people coming forward like this, gave it some attention. They spent 2 years working on it and produced the book Phone Calls from the Dead. This was followed up by a couple of studies in Italy by Massimo Biondi. And then when I was an undergraduate, I discovered this book, saw that there were some newspaper reports about people claiming they've had telephone calls from the dead. The one that perked my interest was a train collision in California. It was a freight train and a commuter train that had collided. And there was a gentleman traveling home to his family called Charles Peck. And the family claimed that there were repeated calls from his mobile phone to them. And whenever they picked up, they could hear static on the line. And when they called back, it just went straight to the voicemail, as though the battery had died or something. They'd seen on the news about the collision, so they believed that their father, their husband, he was caught in the wreckage, and he was perhaps reaching out for his phone and trying to make contact. So they would shout words of, you know, don't worry, the rescuers are coming, you'll be fine, Dad, don't worry, they're coming. At the time they found his body, the calls stopped, and it was never discovered where his phone was. It was never recovered from the wreckage. So there's loads of conventional explanations that creep into my mind as to what was going on there. But it was interesting that the media, the newspapers had pushed this as a phone call from the dead. So that's what brought me back to looking at, well, are there any more unpublished cases by Rogo and Bayliss, and what modern day cases happen? So with Melton, to go back to him, F.R. Melton in Nottingham, this was his adapted device. And it's got some very basic components, as you can see there. You would put on headphones, it was a small wooden box. But in the middle, we have component B, a balloon. So this was a balloon filled with the breath of his older son, and the one who was very skeptical at first, but comes in, believes he's getting messages from his deceased fiance. And so he makes him fill the balloon with his breath, believing it contains then the psychic ether to promote the voices. And he goes about using this device and claims that he had success with it. He'd go to spiritualist churches, people would put on the headphones, listen, and the voice of deceased loved ones would come forward. He later changed the device when speaking in letter correspondence to Harry Price. It was Ghost Hunter of the 1920s device to just have a speaker on it. So you didn't have to put on headphones, everybody could hear at the same time. Harry Price tried to make this device and wasn't successful. Hereward Carrington also tried to make this device and wasn't successful. And we don't know where it is either, so it remains a complete mystery. And there's a picture of Harry for you, just out of interest in some of the letter correspondence that I discovered on this. Even Thomas Edison jumped on the bandwagon. You saw all of those dates of people creating these devices around 1919 through to 1921. So he gave an interview to Scientific American, so a very big periodical that still to this day is a very big outlet. And he gave an interview talking about his beliefs and interests in life after death. He'd had lab assistants that were spiritualists and interest in psychical research and had held seances, and he'd come from a spiritualist background with his parents as well. One of his comments in this article about his idea to build a device that could contact the dead was that if our personality survives, then it is strictly logical and scientific to assume that it retains memory, intellect, and other faculties and knowledge that we acquire on this earth. Therefore, if personality exists after what we call death, it's reasonable to conclude that those who leave this earth would like to communicate with those they have left here. So he gave that interview in 1920. He passed away in 1931. There is no evidence of a device being made. I think it's the Thomas Edison Museum in Texas. One of its highest requests is for blueprints of this device, and they have to turn people away and say that we don't have any. We don't have any photographs of it. There's nothing. It seems to be a bit of a media play. I don't know whether he really wanted to do this or not, but I think he was panicking that people were creating such a device around the world. And it would have been revolutionary if that could have been patented and put out there and people could buy such a thing. So here is D. Scott Rogo, and here is Raymond Bayless. Raymond Bayless was a landscape painter in California. I even have some of his paintings. He was most popular in many ways for that. Some of his paintings hang in government buildings, and he was also the first artist to produce artwork for War of the Worlds. And he's done stuff for H.P. Lovecraft and things like that. Both of them had written on psychical research. Scott would write on a variety of things, even through to Fortean phenomena, about UFOs, Bigfoot. With Jerome Clark, he did an interesting book called Earth's Secret Inhabitants about this. Raymond Bayless was mainly interested in survival of death and had formed a few psychical research organizations in California. For a while, there was the Southern Californian Society of Psychical Research, in which he was a research officer, and so was Scott Rogo as well. But they were both members of the American and the British Society for Psychical Research, and were independent in their fields. Bayless had no academic background. Scott, his undergraduate degree was in music, but he ended up being on the faculty of John F. Kennedy University, teaching a master's degree in parapsychology, along with William Roll and Bob Morris, Carlos Alvarado and Lloyd Auerbach, and many other well-known figures. So he was a walking encyclopedia. People for parapsychology, people had a lot of respect for how much Scott knew. Raymond Bayless passed away in 2004, and unfortunately Scott was murdered at his home in 1990. I'm currently working on a little biography for Raymond Bayless for the Science Encyclopedia, but I'm working on an actual biography book for Scott Rogo. I've been working on his murder case in the last 2 or 3 years because it went unsolved, but I went through his autopsy reports last year, working with Cold Case in Los Angeles, and we finally had his case solved and closed, which is good. That's the story to tell for another time. But there is their book, Phone Calls from the Dead. These are 1970s and 1980s paperbacks and hardbacks with some fantastic cover designs. I mean, even that I think is so much fun with the, we've got the graveside there and the cross, and we've got the telephone lines going through it. And they got a lot of media fame for this. They went on TV programs like That's Amazing. They got in various newspapers. So here's an example here of Raymond Bayless listening into the account and Rogo allegedly getting someone calling up and about a particular case they need to go and investigate. And here's a little treat for you. There's not much footage easily accessible of Scott Rogo. And here he is in a series called In Search Of, which was presented by Leonard Nimoy, in which he's talking about the phone calls from the dead.
One man may have uncovered evidence that implies spirit communication may occur with remarkable frequency. D. Scott Rogo is the author of Phone Calls from the Dead.
Well, I first heard about these cases when I first entered the field, which was close to 10, 12 years ago. And I really didn't take them seriously at all. I thought they were very outlandish. It was hard for me to believe that people were actually getting phone calls from people who were dead. But as the years progressed and I did more and more investigations, I discovered that these calls were fairly common. And then I realized that there was a major effect here that someone really had to study.
Mary Meredith of Oklahoma City recreates the night she purportedly received a phone call from the dead.
Hello? Of course, I don't tell everybody about it. because a lot of people still think that I'm crazy when they even hear about it. But I know that it was, and it happened to me.
Mary Meredith's case occurred in 1977. She had just been in the hospital. She had returned to her home, not knowing that there was a letter waiting for her telling her that her cousin had died. She had been very close to this cousin. It was very soon after she read this letter from her mother that the phone rang, and it was from her cousin.
It just really upset me when I got the phone call, and I hung up on the first phone call because it upset me. But when she called back again, I said, I cannot believe that anyone would call someone and tell them that it's their cousin when my cousin is dead. I can't believe this. I said, and I have been sick, and I can't believe anyone would pull something on me like this. She said, but I know you've been sick. I was at the hospital with you. And I said, what are you talking about? And the phone started getting crackling, and then I couldn't hear her. No, it just faded away.
The idea that dead can contact the living through electromagnetic devices is certainly not new with my research. Thomas Edison, for instance, several years before his death, became very fascinated with the idea that he could invent a machine that could bring through the voices of the dead, and even apparently made some sketches of such equipment. Edison, as is well known, was extremely paranoid about his ideas and kept them very, very hidden. So he never patented his ideas, but certain sketches did.
There we go. There's a little bit about Scott.
The machine he was working on.
Here are some examples of the other books that they produced. So as you can see with Raymond Bayliss, it was very much geared towards survival, and Scott was writing on a number of different things. The book, The Haunted Universe, is about the idea that even with UFO type phenomena, is that actually a experience, it's a psychic experience. We are projecting in some way the UFOs or the aliens. So it's very interesting and an overlap to 14 phenomena, an interesting idea posed. And he'd done at least 3 or 4 books to do with UFO type phenomena. I love the tiny one there that is very scarce now as well. Phone Calls from the Dead is very hard to get hold of, but ESP and Your Pet is also difficult. We are steadily, though, with Meredith Rogo, his niece, who has the rights to all of his books now, starting to reprint these. So a couple have been done, but ESP and Your Pet and Phone Calls from the Dead, which is so tricky because we're trying to track down Raymond Bayliss's rights. They're on the list to do. But don't you love that cover? You know, someone's doing the Zener cards there, so you've got your 5 choices of star, cross, wavy line, circle, square, and is looking at star, and the cat has put 4 on it. I love it. It's really nice. And some of the things mentioned in that book are essentially what Scott Rogo was writing on in Fate magazine. He was a consultant editor and did loads of articles in the book review section. And the articles that he would produce for that, or his summary of different studies, because he'd attend the Parapsychological Association convention every year, that they would end up as small articles. And he'd go and to like the dog tracks and look at the dog races and do small ESP tests on people betting on the dogs and things like that. So some of these nice little articles and his experiences end up in many of these books. They're interspersed with studies through to personal experiences of people that he knew having experiences. So there's great examples of everyday experiences versus the empirical studies that are being done in parapsychology. So additional books. Was there anything after Phone Calls from the Dead? Well, he did another book called Life After Death, The Case for Survival of Bodily Death, and there's a chapter in there on Phone Calls from the Dead. And for Raymond Bayliss, he did this book with, I suppose, his next, in many ways, someone that he mentored, Dr. Elizabeth McAdams, who became the president of the Southern Californian Society for Psychical Research. And there's a very, very short chapter in there on Phone Calls from the Dead, but no real progression in terms of the research that they were doing. In their book, they'd taken 50 cases of unusual telephone calls and did a content analysis to look at any particular themes that may be emerging, and also the frequency of those particular features. So there we go, mention it there. And from that, they found 4 different types of calls, which were, now let me get this straight, they were simple, prolonged, answer calls, and intention calls. There we go. Even this early in the morning and after a night out drinking, I've still got it stuck in my head. And then Biondi did a further study, but with a very small sample. He reached out to people through newspaper advertising. Further content analysis carried out using an Italian sample. 20 cases were found in which some of them had interest and overlaps to Rogo and Bayliss. I think he got more cases besides that, but the actual quality and content just wasn't enough. There wasn't any conversation going on within those telephone calls. It was just people having unusual experiences about ringing and so forth. So they weren't relatable to the actual documented conversations going on in the previous studies. So with Rogo and Bayliss, their previous research failed to meet the request of Dr. Gertrude Schmeidler. In the back of their book, they invited 3 people to offer peer review to what they'd done in the book. So it makes for an interesting final chapter / appendices. So you've got Gertrude Schmeidler, John Beloff, and John Palmer, all offering critical commentary on the work that they've done. And Schmeidler said, it's a good piece. They're both well-known in parapsychology and well-respected, but this is a very casual study in the fact that it's ended up in a book. You need to take this to the next step and put it in a journal, a peer-reviewed journal, and you need peer assessment. But that never happened. And it also needed to be done to make their findings more clear as well. You can find all the details about how many people they had in different categories, but it's not signposted in the book. It's not in the table of contents. You've really got to dig through their book, as I did. My original copy, when I was writing on this a lot, it was full of sticky notes. So every time I found important facts and figures, they were there, and that all needed summarizing in a very clear paper. There's obvious confusion as well because of this by some of the people that reviewed it. So all I could do to find further views and commentary on phone calls from the dead was to find all the book reviews from 1979 onwards. So there was one by Julia Hardy that was, I think, published in Parapsychology Review, which was the magazine of the Parapsychology Foundation, and also Cox in Theta. They struggled to source the findings in that, and they got some of the sample sizes wrong. And I think there was particular negative commentary from Hardy regarding this and the overall study. But on the whole, the reviews were actually quite promising, and people said, even though it's a controversial area and it's going to make people feel a little bit uneasy, it's actually a very good study. It's great that they've actually broached this topic and opening up the doors to it. It's opening up conversation. So this was my book, 30 Years On, taking some of the unpublished accounts of Rogo and Bayliss and some new ones regarding emails and text messages to devote some chapters to talking about those. But I took the next step that they didn't. So I honored the request of Gertrude Schmeidler, and after I'd finished writing the book, I then took the core elements of what I did and I published it in the Journal of Parapsychology as an independent study. So it went through peer review. I was looking at the same thing as them. I discovered that the themes were quite consistent, but in my sample, I found an extra element, mixed calls. So just to talk you through the different types, a simple call would be where you are aware someone has died, and yet, hang on, no, I'm getting this wrong, sorry, I will blame that on being early in the morning. The call comes through, you don't know anyone has died. Oh, God. Right, no, go back to the first one. Go back to the first one that I said. You know someone has died. You're sat at home, the telephone rings, you pick up the telephone and you can hear their voice or static or wind on the line. It's very short and brief. They're very unresponsive. And usually that person's alone when they have that type of call. It's short, it's simple. Prolonged calls, you don't know anyone has died. You pick up the phone, you could have a half-hour-long conversation with your friend Joe, let's say, and Joe talks about this and that and projects you're doing and says, oh, you need to take it over now, you finish it, you're doing so good with it, and mentions about going away on a long holiday, something like that, but you're not really particularly thinking about it at the time. Put down the phone, ding dong, someone's at the door, you go and answer it, it's your friend Mary, she seems very upset. Oh, what's gone on, Mary, what's happened? Oh, didn't you hear? Joe died earlier today in a car crash or something like that. And you say, well, they can't have done. I've just been speaking to them on the telephone. And so all of a sudden, the circumstances start to become apparent as to what's happened. That's what those kinds of calls are like. Not knowing that the person is dead has somehow prolonged the telephone call. Answer calls, this is where you make the telephone call. And it could go one of two ways. It could be either that you make a telephone call to someone you don't know is dead at the time, and yet someone answers with their voice characteristics and knowledge, and you have a prolonged call, or someone you know who actually is alive, they're actually verified to be somewhere else when the telephone call happens, and yet you seem to be speaking to them. So what's going on there when they're somewhere else and yet someone still answers with their voice characteristics and knowledge? Raymond Bayliss and Scott Rogo discovered this a few times themselves while writing the book. They'd had some experiences of this. I discovered an extra type where some people could be aware that someone was dead, and yet they'd had repeated calls over a very long period of time, sometimes even over a 3-year period, which was very unusual. It was just a few cases, but it just didn't match type 1, 2, 3, or 4 as it was the intention call. So I sneaked in number 4 to be mixed calls. And then intention calls are where you intend to make a call to someone, but the last minute, for whatever reason, you change your mind, and yet the call still seems to take place for that person. So there was one particular instance of this that Scott Rogo had, stuck out, and he mentions it in the book and also in his later chapter that he puts in the book. And you can tell I've done this talk so many times that I remember it verbatim. It was 10 o'clock on a bright Thursday morning, and I was thinking about making a call to a friend of mine at the UCLA Neuropsychiatric Institute. Although I thought about making the call, I changed my mind and ended up marking some papers instead and editing. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, I got the surprise of my life when a call came in to me from the very office of the psychologist I thought about calling. It was their research assistant saying he was answering my message. When I asked what in blazes he was talking about, he said at 10 o'clock that morning, a call had come into them from me, someone leaving my name and number and asking that the call be returned. So that's what those calls are like. This was an instance, and just controversies and sociology involved in the social sciences, where they remember being in their early teens and having repeat telephone calls over a three-year period, discovering in her diary accounts of these calls that don't really make sense. I love her. She got in touch with I passed away, and the calls seem to continue. The stories outlined in the original book, Telephone Calls from the Dead, the one that I wrote. And as you can see, Sunday morning, my darling phoned to say that he loved me and would always be at my side. He said that he had come back with me, and now I must be happy. I have been good, and soon he will come again and talk to me. So Dr. Jones, as a child, remembers a time when his mum out, I think she'd gone shopping or something like that, and one of the calls came in on the telephone that she would usually use. And so he picks it up, and he said that he heard the sound of wind and static on the line, really in a panic that this was the phone in which his mum got calls from a deceased friend, loved one. In absolute panic, "She's not here," yelled it down the phone, "She's not here," and slammed the phone down. And he said later on he really regretted it because he wishes now he knew what was going on. That is just a complete air of mystery as to what was going on in that instance. So the frequency of call types. Well, in the follow-up study that I did, type 1 calls seem to outnumber type 2 calls by almost, in the original study by 3 to 1. No, I'm getting this wrong. The type 1 calls outweigh the type 2 calls in my study by 3 to 1, and the original found 4 to 1. Calls from the dead seem to outweigh calls from the living by just over 7 to 1. In the original study, 8 to 1. And we're working with a fairly small sample size here because it's 50 and then another 50, but it seems to be fairly consistent in terms of calls from the dead seem to be most popular, and these other call types do swell, but they're just not as recognized. And there must be many more besides that just people aren't acknowledging as an unusual account to then report onwards. They're just thinking, oh, glitch with the telephone. But when you look into some of these cases, like I've just mentioned, the Scott Rogo example, they really are quite fascinating. Other things seem to occur. You could get the dead or some sort of voice giving you precognitive information, warnings, emergencies. Rogo and Bayliss had even found in the autobiography of the porn star Linda Lovelace, it was a book called Ordeal, in which she was suffering domestic abuse at the hands of her fiance, and they'd driven her away somewhere and they were staying in a motel. And she said that she'd been thinking of her father, who was always her safety net, her protector, and just wanted his help to get out of the situation, to have her father scoop her up and take her away from her abusive fiance. And as they were staying at the motel, there was a knock at the door, and they opened it, and it was her father. She said, "How did you know I was here?" And he said, "Well, you called me in a panic saying that you needed help and you needed me to come and get you." She was thinking about calling him, but never actually did, and she needed his help to get away from this abuse. So maybe there was an instance of that there. Anniversary calls, so the anniversary of someone's death or something else significant, about 8% of cases that was noticed. Cases where there were just audible anomalies, so someone has died and then the phone keeps ringing just to hear static and no voices, or other unusual auditory problems with the telephone, 34%. Some people reported voicemails, so we do actually have a recording, or what they said was a temporary recording that somehow disappeared, maybe within a day or a week afterwards. Haunting related phenomena, so you could have a telephone in a haunted location and it would keep ringing, or people would report voices on that. And it could even be a defunct telephone, so it's not even plugged into the telephone line, it's just a relic of previous technology, it's just there. And then also dreaming about telephone calls to the dead. There was a paper in a mega Journal of Death and Dying by Barrett between 1991 and 1992 about dreams of the bereaved. And they referenced phone calls from the dead by Rogo and Bayliss because they found that there were a number of dream scenarios that people reported when bereft where they weren't having a face-to-face interaction with the dead, they were having a telephone call. So, original criticisms, what came up? Well, Roger Anderson gave probably the most detailed book review of phone calls from the dead in the Journal of Religion and Psychical Research. He said that the cases are not evidential, thus the researchers have no right to argue that a body of collected cases taken as a whole and analysed is a legitimate approach to spontaneous cases. Patterns do not mean evidence or true findings. The cases don't cluster around the time of death. Failure to research cases to their full, and they could be explained by hallucinations, dreams, hoaxes, or expectancy and suggestion. So a lot of big sweeping statements here, and in true Rogo style, he did look out for book reviews, and things like this would really ruffle his feathers. And he would do a response just as long, if not longer, and take every point and respond to them. So he said, Mr. Anderson's criticisms cannot explain the majority of cases. His possible explanations are not consistent with what is known about hallucinations and expectancy. They found that no one was expecting to have a telephone call from the dead. And just because you are bereft doesn't mean that you would necessarily hallucinate apparitions of the dead or telephones occurring. You can have all sorts of negative consequences of suffering from separation anxiety, but these are quite extremes. And in some instances, there are more witnesses. So Anderson's explanations don't seem to weigh up on the whole. And distorted presentation of cases. So Anderson gave some examples of cases that they mention in phone calls from the dead and broke them down to then demonstrate to the reader that, well, you know, this must have been a prank because people knew that person was dead. And in his description, he'd actually added additional witnesses that weren't in the cases described by Rogo and Bayliss. So that Rogo brought him up on it and said, you've taken the circumstances of the eyewitness testimony to make it fit your explanation and dismiss the case. And that's not as it was. So it was a really interesting back and forth. And it even caused a couple of people to publish some letters to editor to keep this debate going, just for 2 more letters, I think, after that. But Anderson's report is really worth the read. So after all of this, and after producing telephone calls from the dead, I started digging further. My PhD at the University of Northampton was on thanatology. It was looking at bereavement, and it was looking at the health benefits of people having anomalous experiences, more so I could explore the emotion of hope. So I lecture on positive psychology. Hope has always been a fascination for me as to how we can use hope and goal attainment to our advantage. And in a lot of popular literature on after-death communications, people would talk about, or authors would give chapters labeled hoping and coping, or hope as a healer. So I wanted to know how these experiences in general, ghosts, sense of presence phenomena, dreaming of the dead, even the telephone calls, how they gave people hope and how that helped bereavement. So after that, I dug deeper. I immediately did another PhD based on my publications in this area of the telephone calls. And I was already guest lecturing at Manchester Metropolitan University. Asked Neil Dagnall if this would be a good idea, and he thought it would be a fun project. So I submitted 4 peer-reviewed papers, an extensive chapter, and my book to then write a critical commentary on it and then do another PhD viva. But it gave me opportunities to talk about the conventional explanation through to other theories for them, what contribution they make to the survival hypothesis. Do any of these cases actually present good evidence for survival of death? And if so, how do we investigate them in the best way possible? And I even dabbled a little bit with chaos theory as to whether there's any predictability to these experiences or any other spontaneous case. I even went and published on criticisms of the methods of these experiences from the early Rogo and Bayliss study through to my own. Douglas Stokes had produced just a little paragraph in one of his books saying that this research was widely criticized and generally sloppy and credulous. And that was all based just on the Julia Hardy review in the Parapsychology review, which was actually a book review where we know she'd not taken in the facts and figures properly. She'd not really found all the details she needed in the book. So it was a bit misleading what Doug had said in that. And for many of you that knew Douglas Stokes' writing, he was very much against lab studies of psi, but in his last few years had published some really interesting articles in the Australian Journal of Parapsychology regarding unequivocal cases of spontaneous psi, as he called them. So he'd gone back to spontaneous case interest. Hardy and Anderson produced possibly the most negative reviews of the original study, whereas we've got various other book reviews of phone calls from the dead by Rogo and Bayliss that were very supportive. John Randall, who I knew, was kind of against EVP. He didn't like it. He didn't like the book Breakthrough by Rauder. He said he'd put it in the bin after he read it. But he said maybe these telephone calls are something else. He said somehow we need a method for separating the calls that may be paranormal from all these other possibilities. I can't see any way of doing this at present, but you are much more inventive than I am, and something may occur to you. Well, it hasn't quite yet, except for just taking these on a case-by-case basis. But I'm starting to dabble with this area again, and I'm currently in the process of making notes to revise the book and produce a completely new titled, newly revised book, because Telephone Calls from the Dead is completely out of print. There are, just looking at the time, okay. Anomalistic psychological explanations. Well, Anderson brought up some. There could be instances of mistaken identity, maybe hallucinations. It's been argued by, it was Robert Baker in his book Hidden Voices. If the person is bereft, they're alone, and a call comes through, say, from a telemarketing company or offering you double glazing, the idea of intentional amnesia, that maybe we're listening over a genuine caller to hear the kinds of things that we want or expect to hear, just to give ourselves some soothing, coping satisfaction from this self-created anomalous experience. They could be dreams, even daydreams. I've even noted some people saying they had daydreams of telephone calls from the dead. They could be outright fraud, expectancy and suggestion, maybe if they've read up on this topic and they know about telephone calls from the dead, maybe we could entertain that idea. But Rogo responded to those points. I've discussed this idea, even this idea of using Occam's razor, that we look carefully through some of these things that Anderson has mentioned, and we delicately shave off one layer at a time of these possibilities, these conventional explanations, to see if they fit the bill. Is it a universal tool? It's good. I've spoken about Occam's razor in that second PhD thesis, and I've said that some people have misused it. There's some interesting references on, even in parapsychology, it being misused, that it could be a very good tool for taking these steps and going through the conventional explanations, but maybe we only need to shave off one layer, and it could be ESP. Shave off one layer and it could actually be survival operating. But since we don't know the working mechanics behind either of these, or them being one and the same thing, under the bracket, the banner of psi, then we would certainly get criticized for not shaving off enough layers. We're just making that instant jump to psi. It could be the explanation, but Occam's razor at present might not allow us to do it. So we could be misusing Occam's razor in some ways where actually psi would fit the bill. We just don't know how it works, so it doesn't seem to be the sensible option to go to for some people. Survival theory, well, there's deceptive titles. Telephone calls from the dead and phone calls from the dead is deceptive because we know there are other phone calls in there that had nothing to do with that. Anderson stated that we are still lacking in cases of good veridical information supplied by the caller. And it's true, even though there were 50 in the first instance and 50 in mine, some of them just are very short eyewitness statements or reports. We would need a lot more information out of some of these calls if we could get them to really look into good veridical information, such as warnings of things to come before they happen, or the dead telling you about hidden artifacts or information about them you've got to go and look up. Here, I started to discuss the book review battle between Beyond Physicalism and The Myth of the Afterlife, which came out by the same publisher, which it offered a next step to really wrestling with these ideas about survival and what the phone calls could offer us. Not that it's discussed in either of those books, but both books do actually talk about the benefits of neuroscience, certainly for survival research at whole, let's say with mediumship studies being the next step. But one book is really take a post-materialist approach, and the other book, Myth of the Afterlife, as you can imagine, is taking the materialist approach and saying, no, neuroscience can demonstrate everything to us and it can knock on the head the idea of science survival, whereas Beyond Physicalism is saying, no, neuroscience can benefit us and can incorporate dualistic ideas and survival. So both books have sort of really hit, and I'm really simplifying what both books are about, but both have reached a brick wall where both are saying, well, neuroscience is really a benefit to us, but we don't seem to be able to go that much further. But it's because we're dealing with such a big problem here. We're dealing with big questions about consciousness, and it's just such a big territory to map out that we're still doing. There's no real attention was given to explaining good cases of survival within the context of neuroscientific findings in these books. And dualism accepts neuroscience in our understanding of the mechanisms of the brain and mind, but allows for survival to be a possibility, or at the very least, ESP and PK being involved in this. My screen is cutting off some of the stuff at the bottom, so I'm guessing these are some of the things that I broke down in the second thesis. So I looked at, well, where are we with survival? If survival can't explain these cases, what about, I'll skip over this, but ESP and PK? You could have someone that is bereft and psychokinetically, PK, they make the telephone ring. This was reported in the original work that if they had, say, 2 or 3 Bakelite telephones in the house, it would only be during one of these unusual calls, the closest telephone to them that rings, rather than all of the telephones in the house. And it was ringing with a reduced bell tone as well, as though the hammer wasn't hitting the bells at the usual speed that it should. And maybe then when they pick up the telephone, they are receiving information, not through the dead, but via ESP, is a sort of a clairvoyant process, essentially. We could even entertain the idea of multiverse theories. So Professor Bernard Carr is particularly interested in this. If you look at the proceedings of the Society for Psychical Research in his presidential address that was given in 2002, he particularly talks about the 10th and 11th dimension and its potential involvement in psychic experiences, and how multiverses might be able to explain these experiences better than going down the psychology route. It's more of a physics matter than a psychology matter for psi. If you go back to early copies of the Journal of Paraphysics, we even have this with ESP and hyperspace mentioned down there on page 21. So early ideas were discussed about this idea. It could offer a working theory that, much like we're seeing apparitions of the living or of the dead, we're not seeing them actually there, but we're actually experiencing an overlap of realities, and that's why it is occurring. As Herbert states in that issue of the Journal of Paraphysics regarding ESP and hyperspace, matter in space-time is regarded as a group of electromagnetic standing waves. Then there is no reason to deny the possibility of similar hyperspatial standing waves constituting astral bodies, those ghosts that we see, inhabiting the hyperspace, which may on occasion make their presence known by approaching near to the surface and creating a temporary oscillatory disturbance in space-time, by seeing of ghosts, which could, on this theory, be sometimes a mental and other times a physical manifestation. Could even perhaps, maybe, account for the telephone calls occurring. It could also rule out dualistic notions as well. And I can't quite see what I've put at the bottom because it's cut out, but I know we're short of time. Just skipping through these, it just goes back to the thing that we don't have a working model for survival. We don't have the best working model for ESP, but we're getting there with what little person power we've had over time, very little funding in parapsychology. Most people taking this up in their spare time or through retirement. There's very few people in paid positions at universities doing parapsychology, and especially when we look at the whole timeline. And at various PA conventions, there have been panels, symposiums on survival. And here were just some examples where we've got people like Carlos Osis. We'd be more convinced of the survival hypothesis if such seemingly various phenomena could be brought together under some encompassing survival theory. Since we know that under certain conditions, the psyche may transcend space and time, such as an interpretation becomes less improbable in scientific sense. Given such evidence, the onus will fall back to the survivalist to demonstrate the necessity of discarnate spirits in the production of mediumship, trance, possession as evidence for survival, perhaps by using a different model. Studies of the living may give us more easier access to psychological and possibly physical parameters of the consciousness which may survive and of the space in which it survives. This may result in more detailed survival hypothesis that would now have with which to explore possible after-death states. I wish to emphasize again that I do not have such a perfect case and have more hope than expectation of finding one. I can say, however, that I have found actual cases which have features resembling this one, although not equal to in all respects. So they were just presenting their own cases of ghosts and reincarnation, talking about the ideas of survival. Michael Sudduth has this really good book from a philosophical perspective of looking at all these ideas about survival, working models, some of the best cases, and not to spoil the book, but he essentially summarized it by saying, what's the case of survival like? Well, it's good, but it's not great. And it was pretty much soon after doing this book that we had Robert Bigelow, the aerospace entrepreneur in Las Vegas, offering $500,000 for the best essay in 25,000 words for life after death, in which many of us got involved. I was a recipient of one of the awards, an honorable mention. And it seems there were different approaches that people took. We took the approach of looking at mediumship and hauntings and deathbed visions, reincarnation cases, after-death communications, and looking at snapshots of all these different areas and really digging into psychical research literature, past and present, to look for the best cases that don't have seem to have really good working conventional explanations for them. We've just stuck them in the box with a question mark on them. So he's right. No, the case isn't great, but it's good. On the whole, there is a lot of evidence that you cannot dismiss. So keep calm and carry on. It's there. And just to finish up, I am done now. Please go back to the Australian Journal of Parapsychology and look at what Douglas Stokes was getting at with saying that I think the best way to approach these cases is to take them. You cannot take them as a whole and produce sweeping explanations. If you want a good group of cases like Rogan and Bayliss were doing, you need to collect one at a time, and study them and research them, ask questions, interview, look in the history records to the nth degree until you've gone as far as you can, and then save that case, then move on to the next one. Then you know you've got a really good set of cases that seem to be strong. You've gone as far as you can with each one. And you can look into, well, he was looking into this idea of white crows. I liked the idea, he only fleetingly mentioned it, but where some were a bit murky, he wasn't sure, he said grey crows. I don't think you can have purity of a white crow. There's always the possibility of this, that, and the other, that something might have been going on that is not psi, but it looks like it. So I think you can have a good collection of grey crows, and they're certainly not black. But I don't think we can have this white purity in the crows. There's always possibly, as Chuck Hamilton said, there's some error someplace, maybe. So there we go. Thank you very much for your time. As I said, Telephone Calls from the Dead is out of print. I'm trying to rewrite it at the moment. I did it as just a short 1,000 copy run when I was doing my master's degree. But if you really want to read more, there is a chapter on it in Paracoustics that I wrote, and we're currently working on Paravision as well at the moment as well. If you want to get in touch, I've not updated my email. It's actually callum.cooper2@northampton.ac.uk. So remember to put a number 2 after Cooper, and you can follow me on Twitter as well. So there we go. Thank you very much, and I will stop screen sharing.
Wow, thank you so much, Carl. That was fascinating. I think it's more common than we realize, and gosh, that's yeah, and the devices, you know, trying to create a device where you can communicate with the dead. I just want to quickly tell you 2 cases. Myself, many years ago, I had 2 phone calls from my friend. And when I answered, all I heard was static, but I think I heard a very faint voice, but I couldn't quite hear, and then it was stopped. So it's a type 1. And then later on, I found out that my friend passed away before I got the phone calls. And another one is one of my clients. Her husband passed away, and she got 2 missed calls from her husband, but the date and time on her mobile phone showed 5 years in advance, and it was on their daughter's birth date, but 5 years in advance. And all the phone calls before and after were in the current date and time. And she went to the telecom shop and asked, how can this happen? And they couldn't figure out how the phone would have put that date, just those 2 phone calls, 5 years in advance, the same date, which was her daughter's birthday. Yeah, so I thought, well, I just wanted to share with you. Yeah.
I'm glad that you were kind of marrying them up to the call types as they came out saying, oh, that fits type 1. There we go.
Yes, I just learned it from today. Yeah.
Yeah, they seem to be so common, and it's like even Rupert Sheldrake has said it when he goes and does his world tours, and I think it's when he'd gone and given a talk to the Google headquarters, and he said it just happens all the time. Even when he's talking about telepathy, he'll describe the telephone telepathy or the sense of being stared at, and he'll have people in the tea and coffee break come up and say, look, don't tell my colleagues. But I've had that exact experience that you've talked about. And one by one, people will approach him as he's on the way to the loo, or he's sat back down again. They said, don't tell my colleagues. I've had one of those experiences. They'll think I'm crazy. And he said, eventually, most of the people in the room have come and had a one-to-one and said, I can relate to that experience. And he'll go back to the podium and say, you all need a coming out party. You'll have a lot more fun. You're all in the same boat, and you don't know that you've all had these experiences, and you daren't tell each other. And it's the same for these unusual telephone experiences. The after-death communications are very common. Even some of the studies that ended up in the British Medical Journal in 1971, they found that over 50% of the bereaved population will have these experiences. And with what we've done with our more recent survey, we published a summary of it in the British Journal of Psychiatry Open. We'd done a survey of over 1,000 respondents. And in that, some people had had after-death communications from deceased people they didn't know. So they weren't even bereft. It had nothing to do with bereavement. We were just talking about cases where people had seen someone soon after they died. Someone had had these experiences and then quickly found out that it was a known deceased individual, but not to them. So it's not always to do with bereavement either, but they're very, very common.
Wow. Yeah, Lance, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, thanks, Cal. Excellent. So we finally meet face to face.
Yes, I'm liking the beard. I'm liking the beard.
After thousands of emails, I think. So,
Yes.
just a quick question about voicemail.
I think you're saying you're breaking up a lot, but you're saying them. Are you saying the most compelling types of voicemails because you've got the recording?
The time you get as well.
Yeah.
Did you get all that?
You can't what I got out of it was that, I mean, we don't have many of them on file, voice recordings, but they are there. I've even had cassette tapes sent to me from old telephone answering machines to listen to some of these things. And yeah, you have the timestamp, but I've noticed with some on the mobile phones that someone could even die in the interim of some of these things getting lost in cyberspace. I've had text messages turn up 4 years after people I've been going out with or something like that, and them saying, do you want to go and see this film tonight? And it's a film that was at the cinemas several years prior, and I'll reply to what you're talking about. That's been on DVD for ages. And they'll say, oh, I sent you that several years ago. Where has that text message been in all that time? And yet someone could die in that interim, and then it turns up and it seems like an unusual text if it was related to something else. But there was, after Constantine Rambler died, so this is, again, the person who wrote Breakthrough, there were alleged telephone calls from him that people recorded in France, Germany, and America. And in the journal, ITC journal, that is it Annabella Cardoso? She edits that journal. There was an early interesting paper where someone had taken these recordings of allegedly Constantine Roundabout after death making these telephone calls, and compared the audio acoustical properties to recordings of him when he was alive to see if they matched up, which is great when you've got the recording. You can do something additional with the spontaneous case. And in those studies, they didn't match up. But then that poses two things. Why would it? You've got voice being produced by a non-biological system in the aftermath and the line to produce recognized speech. Or if it's an outright prank, it's not going to be the same either. It's someone impersonating the other person, so it's not going to match up. So either way, it's not really telling us a lot, but it's still interesting that we're actually capturing some of it. You could trace the telephone call. Where's it come from? Does the telephone company have a record of who made the call? In some instances of the early cases, there would be records of all normal calls coming in and going out, but not the one that was anomalous. It wasn't on the telephone company record, as though it had been produced through the telephone itself, not through the telephone line. So it sends us into a whole world of debate when it comes to the voice recordings and where have they come from? What does it actually mean when we've got the recording? It's an Occam's razor instance again, of looking at all the likely explanations. Has got a grudge against you? Have you annoyed someone lately? Are they going to make this prank? Do they know you've lost a loved one? As you say, you were cutting up a bit, Lance, but hopefully that answers some of your questions.
Okay, just two more questions. So we have one from Rob. Do you have an opinion on the later day technology of the spirit box? Plenty of videos on YouTube. Many seem fake, but a few appear to be legitimate. Thank you.
Yeah, I get into a lot of battles with the ghost hunters. I go on some TV shows now, and then the latest one I was involved in was called Paranormal Captured, which is like, I don't know if you have Gogglebox, but Gogglebox is a TV program which is essentially families around the UK just being filmed watching their telly, and you'll get their reactions to Strictly Come Dancing or a film just to see what all these different families are doing and how they react to different things. And Paranormal Capture was like that. It had myself and a behavioural expert sat in a Chesterfield armchair, and then four ghost hunters sat in the chair reviewing YouTube footage of allegedly paranormal activity, ghost caught on tape and other things, and poltergeist activity. But two of them would go out and do a haunting investigation, and they would take equipment along. And these people had no background in parapsychology, no training with this equipment, weren't physicists or environmental physicists. So they were using ghost boxes and EMS and not knowing how to. And it was the amount of things I was saying to the producer, saying, there's nothing for me to comment on here. They don't know what they're doing. They're running around this building. They're mistaking everything. They're misleading the public. Please stop. Even using Ganzfeld techniques in the haunting environment, and it was just odd. It was really odd. But with the ghost boxes, they were essentially a gimmick that came up when people realized that following Most Haunted and various other shows, that people were buying a lot of EMF meters and thermal image cameras and data loggers and all sorts for these investigations. People were becoming keen to build their ghost hunting box and what they could do and how they can make a haunting investigation interesting. But with the ghost box, what it essentially is a radio that's, every time you want to change station, sometimes a basic radio has just a button that scans to the next working frequency, latches onto it, and keeps that clear frequency. And if you're not happy with it, you press the button again. The ghost box doesn't have that button. It just scans and goes over and over. And so it'll skip every working station. So you'll get static and the football results today are, and then an Elvis song and a weather report. And you get little bits of a voice here and there and something else. And so if you start posing questions to it, you completely get this, I suppose, auditory pareidolia effect, where you're looking at something. With pareidolia, you might be looking out for a face or images in the clouds that make sense. With this, you posed a question and you know what to expect of the answer. And so if you listen long enough, you hear the name Chris or someone mentioning someone's mother who's passed, something comes out that makes sense, and you go, did you hear that? And maybe group conformity takes over as well, that you're making sense out of nonsensical sound, or sometimes legitimate voices and words, but they're not coming from the context of what you're thinking. It's a gimmick. I don't see that the ghost box was made for that purpose. And then now there's a whole minefield of YouTube videos using this and people insisting they're doing it as a serious study and so forth. If anyone wants to do a serious study on EVP, it goes back to what we've talked about. Reel-to-reel tapes, cassette tapes, fresh ones in their packet, or dictaphones, soundproof boxes, controlled environment. Don't walk about with it in your hand, where actually your hand holding it creates feedback on the dictaphone. It's all clumsy and clunky. Go back to the original reports. It's a lot of sitting in silence, soundproof boxes, maybe pose questions and ask out, and then see when the recording device has been placed in a circumstance where it's not allowed, it's not capable of recording things in the room, if it's still recorded something. And in these early studies, it seemingly did. So go back to the heart of it with the good stuff. Even some of the modern day stuff, they'll take a digital EVP, recording, and then clean up the feedback and see what's through some of the static in that. And that you don't need to do that. The classic EVPs, it plays what's there. It's sometimes a fishing expedition with some of these things on YouTube, and what I just mentioned, cleaning up the file. You're looking for it. Let it be there. It's either there or it's not.
Thank you. Don,
I hope that answers the question. It's not too cruel. If you're using ghost boxes, that I'm giving you a bit of tough love there. I don't trust them.
No, it's good. Yeah, because it is very gimmicky.
That's an excellent talk. Really enjoyed it. I experienced a call from the dead. Now, are you collecting these stories? Is this something that I can email
I'm going to
you?
keep going with these. Yeah, please email me. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, will do. That's all.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Don.
Right. Thank you so much, Carl. Yeah, that was really, really fascinating, really. And yeah, the implications for future. I'm imagining real phone call, phones that we can use maybe in the future. But, yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, we better let you go and maybe have your morning coffee.
Yeah, I think I do need some coffee. I've got to drive back to Nottingham in a bit and take my daughter swimming later today.
Yeah, well, we really appreciate your time and your knowledge. So, all right, thank you. And
thank you so much. Good to see you all. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Yay.
Bye, everyone.